Thank you, Simon and Sarah, for that wonderful introduction and for providing us with this excellent opportunity to discuss the spiritual or religious dimension of British modernism. And thank all of you so much for joining us today. We're exceptionally lucky to have Sarah Turner as our first keynote speaker, as Sarah has done an enormous amount to bring about this renewed interest in the spiritual aspect of modernism in recent years, not only through her own research, but by bringing together an international community of scholars through her Enchanted Modernities research network, which she co-founded and which was sponsored by the Leverhulme Trust. She's currently Deputy Director of Research at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art in London, and from October, she will be taking on the role of visiting senior lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art. She has published her work in exhibition catalogues and academic publications, as well as online. She's co-editor of the open access online journal, British Art Studies, and she was recently named one of Apollo Magazine's 40 Under 40 inspirational people in the European art world. Please join me in welcoming her.
I feel like you're all going to guess my age now. Great, well, thank you so much to Eleanor and to Lucy for this really kind invitation to a really fascinating and very timely conference, and to the staff, including Kate and Lizzie at the Hepworth, who helped arrange travel and accommodation and brought us all here for what I know promises to be a really exciting day of ideas. Okay, I'm going to launch straight into my paper and start off with a section called The Revival of Mysticism. On the 1st of November 1907, an article headed Proposed Art Group, HPB Lodge, appeared in the Theosophical newsletter, The Vahan. The desired aim of the group, according to the article's author, the poet, journalist, playwright and artist, Clifford Bax, was to provide artists with a better opportunity for studying and demonstrating the connection between art and theosophy. The relationship was, Bax believed, a fertile but hitherto unexplored one, because the Theosophical Society had concerned itself primarily with science and philosophy, ignoring the potential of the connections between art and spiritual life in the modern world. Theosophical doctrine, Bax argued, lacked colour, warmth and beauty, something he was certain that contemporary artists were more than capable of remedying. Over the course of the next 7 years, Bax and a group of artists, writers, poets, musicians and actors gathered together to explore the idea of the spiritual in art, publishing a journal to document their activities. The members of the circle covered a surprising medley of topics, including women's suffrage, astrology, Indian art of music, the Futurist exhibition in London, Jacob Epstein's Tomb of Oscar Wilde, the art of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and the role of Greek plays performed in the East End of London, representing something of the eclecticism and interconnectedness of much Edwardian intellectual and cultural life. And I've just been showing you a range of images from their journal, which they named Orpheus. Clifford Bax envisaged his circle of artists not simply as a theosophical artistic community based in London, but the foundation of, and I quote, an art movement which shall be mystical, as definite a movement as the Pre-Raphaelites or the French Impressionists, end of quote, choosing two rather diverse examples as models for his art circle. It is for every member, he continued, to demonstrate how the highest mood or thought which is capable may be sent forth in beauty to the world. We have a profound philosophy to shape into a new form. We are mystics as we are artists. Let us be worthy of the name, end of quote. Founded in New York in 1875 by the Russian-born mystic Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, I'm just trying to emulate her garb here, as you can see with my own jacket. and American lawyer Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, the Theosophical Society, the Art Circles' parent organisation, blended esoteric teaching with scientific rhetoric in its promotion of a belief in the universality of all religions, although the spiritual teachings of Asia and the Far East were particularly influential, and the international headquarters of the Society were established in India as early as 1882. As Madame Blavatsky wrote in her Key to Theosophy, published in 1889, the meaning of the word theosophy translated as divine wisdom, and more evocatively perhaps, she described it as, and I'm quoting her here, a shoreless ocean of universal truth, love and wisdom, reflecting its radiance on the earth, end of quote. The Theosophical Society was not a niche or secret society. On the contrary, it quickly went global, establishing a cosmopolitan movement that acquired worldwide adherents with lodges across the world, and it's still active today. The Society quickly gained a following in Victorian Britain and was particularly active in the late 19th and early 20th century under the leadership of the dynamic social reformer Annie Besant, who became president in 1907. Theosophical ideas had much cultural currency beyond its official membership in the early 20th century, and its promotion of the universality of all religions gained much interest and were widely discussed at the time. The TS also had its detractors, frequently caricatured as table rappers, misfits, social and sexual radicals. Theosophists came in for their fair share of journalistic ribbing, academic mistrust and public scorn. But what the Theosophical Art Circle had to offer, Bax believed, was something that had the potential to unite many artists, theosophists or not. And I quote here, "We might repeat 1,000 times, but always in vain. We seek only the ideal or the mystical, as opposed to mere realism or sensuality," end of quote. So today, I want to use the activities of the now little-known Theosophical Art Circles and its publications to explore this complex layering of art, modernity, and mysticism at the beginning of the 20th century. Bax and his group of enchanted artists have largely disappeared from view, and the critical significance of these relationships between art, culture, and the mystical in the 20th century, with the exception of a few well-known case studies, namely, I think that of Kandinsky and Mondrian, have been left untapped. Possibly because, as the historian Alex Owen has suggested, and I'm quoting her here, the very notion of mysticism and the occult seem to run counter to our conception of modern culture and the modern mindset, which has been largely characterised as disenchanted. What the activities of the Theosophical Society and the contents of Orpheus make clear is that, over a century later, boundaries which now seem like impassable divides were never stable. The spiritual, the social, the political, the scientific, and the aesthetic coexisted in many of the contemporary discussions about the future of modern life, modern art, and the modern individual at the beginning of the 20th century. This conference on religion and modernism, and the themes explored in the exhibition upstairs, dedicated to the work of Stanley Spencer, are, I think, an indication that the notion of a completely secular, somewhat disenchanted modern art is gradually being replaced with a more nuanced understanding that thinks seriously about the impact of religion, spirituality, and mystical thinking on the aesthetic ideas of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Identifying this interest and presence is one thing. How we go about working with and understanding the relationships of these ideas and interests, how they were made manifest in material form of the artwork, is altogether more difficult. How do we identify the mystical in art? What does religion look like when made visual? An interest in mysticism was part of what the historian Josie Harris has described as that other face of modernity, reminding us that there were at all times many different perceptions of what constituted the modern. This Janus face modern looked forwards, dreaming of utopian futures, whilst always also looking backwards to take inspiration from a deep and ancient past, with one face negotiating the physical realities of modern life, while the other turned to look for more spiritual and otherworldly modes of being. Writing his book, The 1890s, in 1913, the critic Holbrook Jackson assessed the cultural mood in Britain at the end of one century and at the beginning of the next. Physical excess, he stressed, went hand in hand with spiritual desire, a revolt against rationalism, and the beginning of the revival of mysticism. Bringing together the material and spiritual into a codependent and subtle relationship, he described a swell of a wave of transcendentalism that swept the country, seeking the regeneration of society at the beginning of the 20th century. The poet and the social theorist Edward Carpenter, writing in 1916, brought together what he described as, and I quote, the new currents in theatrical, musical, and artistic worlds, together with the torrents of change in the religious world. And it is this strand of early 20th century artistic culture, which I call the mystical modern, that concerns me today. By immersing ourselves in the debates about religion, spiritual life, and metaphysical speculation, we can start to reevaluate the reputation of artists like Spencer, and indeed others, such as David Jones, who I think we'll hear about later on, and Eric Gill, and the work of artists of my Theosophical Art Circle, who I'll say more about in a minute, and think about them less as religious eccentrics, those are the words of the art historian Francis Spalding, but think of them not as somehow set apart or different from the modern, and instead see religious subject matter in all its various forms, orthodox to heterodox, and more obliquely a belief in the power of the visual to provide spiritual revelation as inherently part of the narrative of modern art, part of that intense probing, that soul-searching, which the most powerful of contemporary art of any age does. The impact of these cultural discourses on art is not always that easy to trace, and the terminology is difficult. What do we mean by religion, the mystical? And I think that's something we're really going to grapple with today throughout our papers and perhaps more thoroughly in the conversation. The Theosophical Art Circles' quest to create a mystical art movement at the beginning of the 20th century was lofty and ambitious. In the first issue of the journal, Bax described its purpose as, and I'll put this up here, number 1, to form the nucleus of a worldwide movement for exalting the ideals of art. Number 2, to encourage the study of international art and the sympathetic inclusion of all methods, Eastern and Western, in the search for beauty. And 3, to investigate the means whereby ampler modes of expression may be discovered and the latent powers of the artist demonstrated. I think these are quite radical ambitions at this moment in 1907. Those who responded to the clarion call were listed in the first issue of the journal in 1907. And they included the artist and critic Frank Rinder, the artist and radical suffragette Olive Hockin, the actress Gwendolyn Bishop, and the musician and musicologist Maud McCarthy. And I've put some of those names were listed there on that front page. Other artists such as William Shackleton, John Duncan, A.E., who also known as George Russell, the Irish nationalist poet and artist, Frederick Cayley Robinson and Cecil French, became associated with the art circle in subsequent years before the venture folded in 1914. I feel that I should also mention Stanley Spencer here, since this exhibition prompted this conference, and I think the ideas associated with it. Spencer was not part of the Theosophical Art Circle, nor is it my intention to suggest in any way that he had direct contact with this group of artists. To my knowledge, he did not, but some of you may know otherwise. But what I do want to emphasise is that ideas and subjects which have been used to single out Spencer as somehow different, eccentric, peculiar, idiosyncratic, or as the outsider of British modernism, such as his ideas about the visionary power of the artist and the enchanted potential of the landscape, were actually very much part of the texture of the cultural debate in the early 20th century and shared by a wider network of artists and writers than has been previously acknowledged. And I think it's this idea of kind of correspondences and how ideas travel through cultural networks, through an orbit, a cultural orbit of ideas that I really want to explore here, rather than direct influence or contact between artists. Paying a heavy debt to symbolism and the art movements of the 19th century, and to pre-Raphaelitism in particular, the work of the artists associated with the Theosophical Art Circle has largely been characterised as an outmoded leftover. Here, just thinking about that visionary artist, John Donne arriving in heaven, and that enchanted landscape of thinking about religious subject matter within the everyday landscape. The work of the artists associated with the Theosophical Art Circle has been characterised as an outmoded leftover from the previous era, soon to be swept away by the tabula rasa of a more hard-edged, one might say, aggressive modernism. The images published by the Art Circle, such as Olive Hawkins' languorous young women shut up in the blue closet, which was published in the journal in 1911, do not perhaps look immediately modern, and most certainly not modernist. The stylistic influences of the 19th century and artists such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris are clearly evident in Hawkins' depiction of the women in a medievalised interior. And the accompaniment of lines of verse by William Morris serves to underline the strong links to the art of the previous century. Of course, there was never a clean break or some single moment when artists at the beginning of the 20th century rejected the art and visual language of the immediate past, never mind what modernist rhetoric would have us believe. The art connected with the art circle is indicative of a stylistic and aesthetic complexity of the visual culture of this period, saturated as it was with the inevitable cultural bleed of the art and ideas of the previous century. Writing about the early 20th century, art historian Tim Barringer has argued for an expanded field of inquiry and debate, a broad history of the visual for the early 20th century, which embraces the eclectic, vital and complex visual cultures of the period, and one which is not premised solely on formal experimentation or stylistic rupture from the past. Barringer suggests that the stylistic revivalism and retrospection were part of a strategy to resolve the issues of the modern world confronted by such artists, rather than as tactics to avoid them. The artists of the Theosophical Art Circle, and I would also argue Spencer, are undoubtedly part of such an eclectic and vital visual culture of British modernism. And it's also interesting to think about the influence of Rossetti and the kind of visionary art of the 19th century on Spencer, particularly when he was at the Slade and in those early years. And I think that's something that sometimes gets sort of, again, hived off in our rush to kind of think about abstraction and post-expressionism. So I'm arguing for this kind of messier modernism, especially in this first part of these early years of the 20th century. The publications of the Theosophical Art Circle give us some notion of the operation of the group, such as who joined and the topics they covered in their monthly meetings, although such journals also have their limits as historical sources. You'll notice that the images are in black and white from the journal as well, something that these artists who were so interested in colour often lamented. So much of that energy of conversation, the sharing of ideas, and the sense of coming together to change something and of being in a movement is difficult, if not impossible, to capture on the page. This circle of artists was not envisaged simply as a theosophical artistic community based in London, but the foundation of what Bax described as an international art movement. The journal was also one of the first in Britain to discuss the work of contemporary Indian artists and published the early art writing of the pioneering art historian Ananda Coomaraswamy as part of its agenda to seek an international art that was sympathetic to the aims of both Eastern and Western aesthetics. The Art Circle was keen to appeal to all artists, as Bax said, who was in search of the ideal, whether or not they be members of the Theosophical Society. But Bax was also aware that its allegiance to the Theosophical Society could be off-putting, complaining that when people hear of a theosophical art movement, they not unnaturally suppose that it means to produce sectarian art, which he added was an abomination. He was very keen that this idea of a mystical art movement not be a niche, but that spread through all different kinds of art movements, artists, and artistic styles at the beginning of the 20th century. The first front cover of Orpheus, designed by Edgar W. Davis, a theosophist and member of the Art Circle, conveys the spirit of the journal. The slight, childlike figure of Orpheus, set in an imaginary abstract landscape, surrounded by an explosion of light shafts, drew on classical mythology. As a poet, prophet, musician, and visionary who enchanted the natural world and promised to mediate between this world and the next, the legendary hero of ancient Greek mythology enjoyed something of a revival in the early 20th century. Orpheus was an apt choice to represent the art circle's ambitions, to reveal the latent powers of the artists. Orpheus's command of the magical arts included astrology, which featured prominently in the journal, while his identity as both poet and musician represented the unity of the arts to which the circle aspired. These artists did not slavishly translate theosophical writings by Blavatsky, Besant, and other theosophical writers into visual form to create what we might describe as a theosophical art, but rather drew on the writings and teachings of the Theosophical Society to formulate their own aesthetic theories and to shape an image of the artist in the modern world as a visionary, a mystic, a maker of magical images, a painter and a poet who had the power to unite the arts. The invisible kept artists, scientists and spiritualists extremely busy at the turn of the century. Vibration, ether, astral waves, thermodynamics and pulses fascinated so many at the time, blurring the boundaries between science, art and the spiritual. Putting theosophy side by side with experimental physics, Charles Ledbetter and Annie Besant commented in their influential 1901 text, Thought Forms, that, and I quote, "The attitude of science towards a thing of the invisible world is undergoing considerable modification. The boundaries between animate and inanimate matter are broken down." The impact on artists of this text and of these incredible, colourful, abstract images within it, especially in relation to the esoteric, symbolic meaning of colour, is a topic of a whole other paper, which I hope to give at some other point in the near future. Yet it was not on the whole the magical possibilities of the new communication technologies or revolutionary science techniques to allow access to the unseen, through which the Theosophical Art Circle members visually depicted the mysteries of the universe. By and large, the artists represented in Orpheus looked to the natural world as resource and inspiration. Landscape became charged with mystical potential. The land and the sea worked into enchanted dreamscapes, where those boundaries between animate and inanimate could be brought together and potentially broken down. The vision of nature charged with mystical force is represented by a Theosophical Art Circle member and Scottish artist John Duncan in his iconic image of the early 20th century Celtic revival movement, the Riders of Scilly, which was reproduced in the 17th issue of Orpheus in January 1912. And it was accompanied by an explanation of the canvas written by the artist. He explained that in the picture, packed with mythological and allegorical figures set against a comparatively naturalistic backdrop, the four riders are shown on their way to the stone circle to initiate chosen mortals into their mysteries. What he described as the Lords of Life are masters of druidic wisdom, and each carries a symbol of his particular power: the tree, the cup, the sword, and the stone. And Duncan had sent a photograph of his painting to Clifford Bax to include in the journal, saying to Bax, I quote, "I hope you like it. Photos of pictures are always disappointing. Do you think it will make a good picture for your magazine? I sympathise strongly with the aims of your paper, and I'm so glad you have managed to keep it going so strong. Live forever." And it's quite nice in the archive when you find these little snippets of artists writing to editors, anxious about their own work and how it will reproduce. And so pasted into Clifford Bax's own copies of the journal are all these lovely postcards and letters from the art circle. And I think we can kind of think about this network of artists really discussing these ideas when we look through their archive. And I know Eleanor's been doing a lot of work on Spencer and using the family's archive, and I think that personal touch comes through in the work that you've done for the exhibition. It is not surprising that John Duncan, who was well versed in the mystical symbolism of colour, was so concerned about the black and white reproduction of his richly hued canvases. And here I'm showing you how they were reproduced in the journal. His St. Bride was also reproduced as a frontispiece in the 24th number of Orpheus. And this painting shimmers with gold, red, pinks, and aquamarines and orange tones, with parts of its surface mimicking other art forms, such as metalwork and embroidery. The abstract patterns of the internal frame of the painting and the angel's ornate wings are not unlike the vibrating, multicoloured thought forms reproduced by Besant and Leadbetter in their Thought Forms publication. But again, this is no slavish translation of theosophical philosophy or colour theory, but rather a fusion, a hybrid of Celtic mythology, modern esotericism, and arts and crafts design theory heralding the unity of the arts. It is a canvas which aims to synthesise these complex parts through the whole of the framed work of art. For another Theosophical Art Circle painter, William Shackleton, writing in the introduction to the catalogue for his first solo show, held at the Goupil Gallery in 1910. Interestingly, that's where Stanley Spencer also held his first solo show in 1927. Well, Shackleton described the environment as a living and spiritual force. He wrote, and I quote, "From a visual point of view, one may simply say that it is the land, the sea, and the sky. These, it is scarcely an exaggeration to say, have also a mind, a heart, and a soul." End of quote. Shackleton is a fascinating and much undervalued Edwardian, 20th century artist, and he was also the subject of an article in the January 1914 issue of the journal, written by the poet and artist Cecil French. And something's just occurred to me as I'm speaking here. A lot of the figures I've mentioned, Shackleton was from Yorkshire, and Holbrook Jackson, a very active career in Leeds, Edward Carpenter living in Sheffield. There's some interesting Northern and Yorkshire connections going on here with these ideas of the mystical. And I think that's something that can be definitely further explored, perhaps in a non-conformist environment or culture where such ideas about the spiritual potential of aesthetics could flower and could grow. Shackleton's painting were widely reproduced in the journal. I'm just showing you a few examples here because, again, they're not widely seen at all. And Bradford Cartwright Hall has an interesting collection, also in Rochdale. I've not been able to locate this work by Shackleton, so again, if anyone's seen it, do let me know. This was used as the frontispiece to that January 1914 issue. And Cecil French, writing about it, described the captivating qualities of the canvas, depicting a group of figures in a shimmering landscape, so shimmering actually that I think it was very hard to reproduce, studded with the symbols of religious life, a cathedral looming over the scene on a distant hill, and a figure kneeling at a wayside crucifix. Of this painting, French wrote, and I'm quoting here, "In it, we find something of all that is evoked by the magical word, be it spring, printemps, primavera, frühling. The canvas itself has surfaces which invite the touch, as does worn ivory or marble. It enchants the sight, as does sunbathed marble or delicate blossom shimmering against a milky sky. The sensuous element, the first essential of all fine painting, holds us as in a net. But slowly we realise that the desirable object is also a talisman." End of quote. For French, it was not simply the subject matter of the painting, nature in spring, the ecstasy of awakening life that was magical, but the canvas itself. The materiality of the painting held powers to enchant the viewer, as to hold them as in a net, he said. Thus the painting was not a passive object, but a talisman, symbolic of the mystical qualities of art and nature. And this conception of the power of art to negotiate between the visible and invisible was shared by other artistic movements, brotherhoods and circles at the time in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Nabi, meaning prophets in Hebrew, a group spearheaded by the painter Paul Seruzier, as well shared this belief. In Seruzier's painting The Talisman, an almost abstract representation of the Bois d'Amour near Pont-Aven in Brittany, painted on a cigar box, became emblematic of the Nabi's belief in the symbolic, enchanted and magical qualities of the visual. The Nabi painters also often textured the surfaces of their canvas, drawing the spectator's gaze to the object itself. And this is something that Cecil French also draws attention to in Shackleton's painting. Looking invokes a desire to touch. The scopic blurs with the haptic in this exchange between the spectator and object. And as such, the surfaces are appropriately compared to other, more sculptural materials, which invite the desire to touch, such as amber, ivory, and marble. And art for Shackleton was concerned with as much with thinking and feeling as with seeing. So again, thinking about this connection between ideas and visual form. Described by art historians as idiosyncratic, a truly independent spirit and hard to place in any context. I think that sounds familiar. We could be talking about Spencer, couldn't we, here? Shackleton has become one of the many artists of the early 20th century to disappear from the narratives of modern art. And when I was searching on that wonderful resource, Art UK, which documents paintings in public collections, I came across this Shackleton here in your own collection, which I haven't seen before, so that was a nice find through doing this paper. He was a great admirer of Turner, as can be seen in the light effects that he produced in his works, and described his style as conscientious symbolism, also greatly admiring the work of Italian Renaissance artists, whom he had studied whilst on a British Institute scholarship to Italy in 1896, also drawing on the work of the Pre-Raphaelites, G.F. Watts, and the contemporary landscape painter Edward Stott. Cecil French argued that it was the technical side of Shackleton's painting which followed in the great tradition of painting and could be traced through Watts back to Turner and Giorgione. His subject matter and pictorial vocabulary were also being described as somewhat out of kilter with a contemporary Edwardian fascination for realistic landscapes, returning instead to what French called the visionary days of Turner, who was Shackleton's artist hero. And there is indeed a strong link between Shackleton's technique and the shimmering palette of colours, for example, in his Farina Elucis, and the luminous qualities of Turner's watercolours and unfinished oils, such as the Evening Star. Such comparisons take on an increasing relevance when we consider the revival of interest in Turner following the opening of the Turner Galleries at Millbank in 1910. C. Lewis Hind's book of the same year, Turner's Golden Visions, gives some insight into the contemporary critical reaction to Turner in the early 20th century and why an association of Shackleton's work with that of Turner is particularly significant at this time. Hind described how on the 5th of February 1906, 26 unfinished oil sketches were exhibited to the public for the first time at the Tate Gallery. And by all accounts, this was the art sensation of the year. For weeks, the appearance of Room 7 at the gallery had what Hind called the aspect of the private view day at the Royal Academy. And Hind described how what he called Anglo-Saxon reserve was broken down and the public wandered around the gallery in amazement and delight, astonished by the shimmering light effects and range of colour tones and hues on display. Without warning, the observer was, and I'm quoting Hind here, transported to the realms of enchantment. And it's really interesting. I was reading Paul Nash writing about looking at Spencer's work, and he used the same phrase as well. Looking at Spencer's work transported him to the realms of enchantment. The notion of a visionary tradition of English landscape painting was certainly not restricted to the work of artists and critics of the Theosophical Art Circle. And it is here that I think they are the most compelling connections between these artists and particularly Stanley Spencer. As art historian Isan Holt has shown, assertions of an English visionary tradition linking back through the Pre-Raphaelites to Samuel Palmer, To Blake was the other visionary landscape artist of British art, were especially significant for critics and artists such as Roger Fry, Lawrence Binion, Stanley Spencer, I'm catching up, Paul Nash, and Augustus John in the early 20th century. The landscapes reproduced in Orpheus could be seen as belonging to this broader context of an early 20th century British art, which has valued the otherworldliness of the natural world, a place of imagined beauty, of real beauty and spirituality within modernity, created through light effects, spatial distortions, and decorative qualities, influenced by artists as diverse as Puvis de Chavannes, the Pre-Raphaelites, and early Italian painters, namely Giotto and Fra Angelico, another two great sources for Spencer's work. Isan Holt argues that this early 20th century interest in landscape and nature was not so much about the tropes of Englishness, but rather the significance of the artist's vision. And again, it's that phrase, I think, the artist as visionary, the artist's vision, which I think is so significant for us here today. Landscape adopts a mystical, spiritual force in which its mythic inhabitants are given meaning derived from an ancient, mystical, and often religious sources. And the same can be said of the work of Shackleton, French, Hockin, Duncan, and Spencer in their shared belief in the painted landscape to transport the viewer to the realms of enchantment, breaking down the barriers between animate, inanimate through the talismanic power of the work of art. Again, it's just worth kind of being wrapped up in these incredible hues of these canvases. A new cover design of the journal, which appeared in July 1912, dropped the image of Orpheus, but continued to draw heavily on the symbolic imagery of the classical world, incorporating 4 athletic male bodies within an antique architectural border. As with other art magazines of this era, there is an attempt to integrate the text and images and the words A Quarterly Magazine of Imaginative Art, edited by Clifford Bax, appear to be carved in the base of this temple-like structure against which the figures rest. In the right-hand corner, just down there, there is a small scroll which contains the initials FCR, standing for Frederick Cayley Robinson, and his dates are 1862 to 1927, who was closely associated with the art circle. Robinson, whose work was reviewed twice in the journal, is another one of those artists who has slipped from the narratives of early 20th century British art, despite the considerable commercial and public success he achieved in his own lifetime, particularly in conjunction with the set designs and costume designs for Maurice Maeterlinck's The Bluebird, which was a huge office box hit at the Haymarket Theatre in London in 1909. It really was on everyone's lips. Maeterlinck's L'Oiseau Bleu was published in French in 1908 and in English translation the following year. In 1911, the book was reissued with 25 full-page colour illustrations by Cayley Robinson, which were also exhibited at the Leicester Galleries in London. Olive Hockin's review of the illustrations, which were reproduced in Orpheus, praised Robinson for his approach to design and illustration, which enabled, she wrote, his pictures to provide more than simply a commentary on what had already been stated in the text. His images, Hockin argued, were the expression of original thought and, she wrote, the expression of it by means of a different set of symbols, the symbolic use of colour and form. Hockin described the effect of the illustrations on the viewer as they entered the gallery, their attention being first arrested by what she described as the extreme simplicity and severity of the pictures, and then by the peculiar methods of their composition. And again, it strikes me that you could use exactly that same critical language to describe Spencer's work when we're looking at those early works, particularly like Nativity and the John Donne work. Hockin interpreted Robinson's compositions, and actually I've just put that comparison there side by side, which I think, again, I'm not saying this is a direct source material, but it's just quite interesting to just do that visual analysis and look at that composition together. Hockin interpreted Robinson's compositions and his use of blank space and simplified forms in particular as part of a new direction of modern art, even as a kind of proto-abstraction, since she argued that they, and I quote, ring out convincingly that message so happily coming to be realised by the 20th century of the vital importance of space and air and emptiness, treasures in themselves that make us loath to allow mere detail to intrude upon. End of quote. The economy of detail, Hockin wrote, was almost mechanical. However, she argued that Cayley Robinson's real talent lay in being able to access the mysterious and the fantastic without resorting to the depiction of fabulous beasts and unearthly monsters, which were the stock in trade of other contemporary illustrators, such as Arthur Rackham. But it was this representation of the commonplace and the everyday to convey spiritual meaning that rang out for her. For Hockin, Robinson's illustrations were entirely in agreement with the message of Maeterlinck's play that confirmed, and I quote, "Romance and beauty are at our doors, even if that door may be one of 100 others that line the streets of a suburb. Beauty is not found at the end of a pilgrimage, but is with us day after day, if we will but open our eyes and see it." End of quote. The spiritual in the everyday was certainly a sentiment that Spencer agreed with and depicted time and again in his paintings of his beloved Cookham. The connections between Cayley Robinson's work and that of Spencer's are particularly striking if we consider their large-scale works painted in response to the First World War. These are, I'm looking at Cayley Robinson's Acts of Mercy series, painted between 1916 and 1920 for the Middlesex Hospital, now in the Wellcome Library collection, and Spencer's series of paintings commissioned for the Sandham Memorial Chapel at Berkeley in Hampshire, which I'm sure many of you will know well. And a recent article by Erica Langmuir in the Burlington magazine in 2014 has suggested that this ensemble by Cayley Robinson, I'll show you another one of the paintings here, may have actually acted as models for the paintings by Spencer, especially in his thinking about the use of large-scale mural works, again this spareness of form, and thinking about spiritual thinking and cultural renewal in response to the First World War. I'm just going to flick back through that series again. There's a lot more to say about this, but I just kind of want to put this out there as a little sort of teaser. Through this discussion of the Theosophical Art Circles work, intermingled with some thoughts about Stanley Spencer, I hope to have shown that by bringing back together art and mystical thinking in many shapes and forms, we can expand the canonical version of modern art at the beginning of the 20th century, which is, I think, still pretty obsessed with a very small handful of figures. Rather than trying to slot the art and ideas of the Theosophical Art Circle into existing narratives of modernism, we might more productively recast it as part of the eclectic, even erratic visual culture of the early 20th century that the history of art has yet to fully account for. Setting Spencer's work within a wider selection of artwork produced at the beginning of the 20th century certainly produces interesting results. And again, I want to stress this is not about influence, but I think it's about being part of a wider cultural discourse about religion and modernity. What we need, I think, is a longer, more generous account, a much more eclectic history of British modernism. This would take into account, rather than dismiss, the importance of visionary dreamers of the late 19th century, such as Rossetti, on the next generation in the early 20th century. It would also pay heed to a much longer lineage of visionary art and magical thinking within British visual culture, looking at the extraordinary spell the work of artists such as Blake, Palmer and Turner continued to cast on much, much younger generations who encountered the work of these masters through important exhibitions mounted in the early 20th century. The mystical modern is not so much a visual style. As we've seen, these works are incredibly diverse, but rather it is an approach that casts its net widely, reviving and resuscitating works, as is the case with the artists of the Theosophical Art Circles, such as Shackleton and Cayley Robinson, that have often been forgotten and ignored, and also reconsidering the work of those artists who've been considered and hived off as idiosyncratic and peculiar, as often is the case with Spencer, and placing them once more within those raging torrents of spiritual, aesthetic, and social ideas about change at the beginning of the 20th century. So my call is for us to embrace the mystical strangeness, make more of that weird world of British art, and think seriously about angels and dirt. Thank you.